everyone, and welcome to the ConTinual Author Spotlight. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and my guest tonight is international best-selling author Karen Rose. Karen has made the bestseller lists of the New York Times, USA Today, London's Sunday Times, Germany's Der Spiegel, the Irish Times, and other lists in South Africa, where she had a #1 bestseller, and in Australia. Her books have been translated into more than 20 languages. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. And not even at a conference. I mean, it's usually conferences.
I know.
Yeah. So your official bio says that you started your working life as an engineer and even earned a couple of patents. And then you gave that up to become a writer. How did that all happen?
Well, it wasn't like I kind of gave it up to, it was more of a, it was more progressive than that. It wasn't like one day I said, oh, I'm going to become a full-time writer. I started writing for fun when I was traveling as an engineer. I was traveling internationally and ran out of books to read that were in English. And so I started writing my own because I was bored. And over the years, the hobby kind of became something I was really serious about. My husband said, why don't you try to get published? And I said, okay. He brought me home from the used bookstore one day. It was a 25-cent book called How to Market Your Bromance Novel. And I did everything in it. And I had spreadsheets and flow charts and I kept records and I got a lot of very nice rejections. And I would have been ready to quit at that point. But my husband found RWA, the Romance Writers for America, online and urged me to go to a meeting. And that would have been in like 1999, the beginning of 1999. And I was still an engineer then. I was still traveling. Shortly thereafter, I left that job. And actually, why I left that job, it kind of ended up in a book. My husband was working as a mental health therapist at the time and was nearly killed by one of their clients. Yeah, it was pretty dramatic. And so he quit. And as the guy had tried to assault my husband, he tried to assault the owner of the therapy practice, I guess it was. And he was arrested. And as they were taking him off to jail, he was basically saying, I'm going to get you, I'm going to get your kids, I'm going to get your family. And he was a sex offender. And so it was a scary time, because we had two children, we had two small children, and we had moved about as far out from the city as we could get. I could still get to work every day. So I left that job because we wanted to move out of the city. We decided it was time to move out of the city. So I left the job, took another down south, and that's where I met you, Nancy. So when I was working that job in Charlotte, and after 9/11, it was a manufacturing job, and that industry kind of for a little while, and I got laid off. And at that point, I had just sold my first book, and that would have been I signed the contract in early 2002. I lost my job like a month later. And so we ended up moving again. We moved to Florida, and I kept writing. So I wasn't an engineer anymore, but I kept writing. And I had my own business for a while. When I needed health insurance for the family, I ended up going to be a school teacher. So I did that for a while. All the while I was still writing. And at that point I was writing about a book every 9 months while I was teaching full time. And when I finally was able, and when you're a teacher, it's not that hard, but when I was finally able to make enough money, if I could write like one more book a year, then I was teaching, I left the teaching job. So it wasn't like I left being an engineer. I did leave being an engineer because of my husband's issue. We moved, lost my job, moved again, and I just kind of wandered into it as time passed. So it was several years in the making before I was a full-time author.
Well, you didn't initially consider yourself a thriller writer, though, did you? How did that come about?
It wasn't, when I first started writing, like I said, I wrote for fun, and I wrote because I was bored. I told that story once, and a lady in the front row said, I would have just gone to the bar. And I was like, couldn't even think about it. I was stuck in this hotel room for weeks at a time. Like, I didn't even think of it. I guess it's good that I was an introvert. Otherwise, I may never have published a book. But hold on, now I think I've lost the question. What was the question?
How did you come to consider yourself a thriller writer to take that slant in your work?
So when I first started writing, the books were more women's fiction, or I think we would call it now romantic elements. The story would revolve around a family, and there really wasn't any suspense in there until I started the book that became my first sale. It was my third book, but it was my first sale, and I had this idea of a woman who had an abusive spouse, left the spouse, and started a new life. And that's kind of where the book started. And it started out as women's fiction, where it wasn't so much about the chase. It was more about her conundrum when she found out that the husband she escaped was being tried for her murder years later. And what do I do? You know, do I pop up and say, here I am, I'm not really dead? Or, or do I just let him go on trial for killing me, knowing that if I'd stayed, he probably would have killed me? And so that was the first book. I sent it out to some agents, and my very first agent, she said, you have a suspenseful voice. Have you ever considered writing suspense? And I hadn't, but I thought, why not? And I liked mysteries. I like to watch them on TV. I was always I can name that killer in 2 seconds person. And so what I did was I went back and I being the engineer, I took a book that had surprised me, because I'm always able to guess the person who did it, always. But there have been a few times I've been stumped. And I went back to one of those books, and I didn't read it backward word for word. I read it backward chapter for chapter, looking to where the author had dropped all the clues. And what I learned was that there really isn't a magic. There's no magic to it, other than the magic of distraction. Because I found I was so concerned and so into the characters that I forgot to look for the clues, because they were there. They were there in plain sight. I just missed them because I was so wrapped up in what was going to happen next to the characters. And so, I've found that's true in all the books that have surprised me and all the movies that have surprised me. It's because I've been so sucked in to what's going to happen next that I forget to look for the clues. And I thought, oh, I could do that. So I rewrote that book probably 2 more times before it finally sold. But that was my first sale and my first thriller.
Well, is the being distracted by wanting to know what's happening next, is that why you decided to read it backwards a chapter at a time?
Yeah. I wanted to know, I didn't want to, because I get sucked in, and I didn't want to get sucked into the story. I knew I got sucked into the story. I didn't realize that was why I was missing the clues. I wanted to really focus. And I was a proofreader back before spell check. We're talking when floppy disks were still 10-inch square. I was a proofreader when I was in college for a company that was a nuclear power engineering company. And they worked with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I would read their manuals and all the documents that they would put out. And I was supposed to be the proofreader. And you read backwards. Like a sentence at a time, so that you didn't get sucked into like you could get sucked into that. But I guess some people could. But I learned to read things backwards to proofread. And so that's why I decided I'm going to read it backwards to see where this woman is dropping the clues. And it's funny because it was Tammy Hogue, and I met her many years later. And I told her the story. She laughed. She goes, well, when you figure out what I did, let me know, because I want to know too. But that's why I decided to read it backwards, because otherwise you get sucked. I just get sucked into the story. If it's a good story, I get sucked into the characters.
Well, I guess when you read it backwards, it doesn't feel quite as connected. It doesn't flow quite the same way. And so maybe it's easier to be analytical about it.
That's exactly it, I think. It's just really more kind of partitioning the structure and the structure and the detail away from the story itself. Because there's so many different parts to writing a book. There's the characters, there's the plot, there's the overall structure, the setting, and how those all things go together is what's intended to suck the reader in. But if you can look at it from a clearly, like you say, an analytical point of view, more of a teaching point of view, I would just go backwards. And in fact, when I get stuck in a book these days, when I'm writing, I go to the end and work my way backwards. to me, that's knowing where the end is and where the beginning is and figuring out how those things come together. For me, that's part of the process.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about process and how much detail you do the plot in for an individual book.
I know a few scenes. I know the backstory for the characters. I always start with the characters. And I know the backstory, and I know maybe 4 or 5 main events as it ties into the characters. Like, here's where they learn the backstory. Here's where they learn this. Here's where this thing connects. And so I do know a few things, and I'll write, my outlines is typically very front heavy. And then I'll say, and many people get murdered and they fall in love and live happily ever after the end. It's kind of the last couple sentences. So yeah, I'll write, and then I'll realize I've kind of gotten either away from the outline I've set for myself, again, very, very brief outline, or I'm just not really sure how to get to the end. I always know who did it, but how they get caught. And the first time it happened, I remember I was really into spreadsheets, really into flow charting. I was called the flow chart queen when I was an engineer. And so I just take sticky notes. And I did, the first time I did this, it was like, oh, and I just said, the villain is captured. I don't even think I said his name. The villain is captured. And that's the way I always start now when I get, because I think it's been about 20 books. I'm writing my 26th book. I think I've been doing this for about 20 books. I'll write, the villain is captured. And then for that to happen, this has to happen. And that, this. And I work my way backwards and on these sticky notes. And then I put them all in order. And then I finish writing the book.
Ah.
In fact, I just did that last week.
Well, congratulations on finishing.
No, I didn't finish. I just did the sticky notes.
Oh, sorry. Well, congratulations on finishing that then.
Thank you.
One step in the process.
That's part of the process.
But one of the things that sets your books apart from some thriller writers is that you always have a romance, and it's always very thoroughly developed with a solid internal conflict and a resolution that's interwoven with the resolution of the story. And was that a conscious choice, or is that just the way the stories happen to come to you?
I think it was the way the stories happened to come to me when I first got started. Some of it was the fact that I just really love to read romance. That's kind of my go-to genre. And it was, I read a lot as a kid. I didn't read a lot in college because you're just too busy reading other things. And I almost forgot what I like to read. And so years later, when I got a job as an engineer and I was doing all the traveling, I don't like to fly. I still don't like to fly. I'm not as terrified as I once was, but flying is still not a comfortable thing for me. And so I always would take a book. But that started because I was afraid to fly. It was because I would get chatty with the guy sitting, people around me. And finally one man, he was really rude, but he was right. He went, lady, just go buy a book like everybody else. And so I was like, oh, and then I'm like, well, what do I like to read? I don't know. So I read everything. And that's when I discovered romance. That was when I realized I could read the entire flight and forget I was on the plane. And then we were there. It was the only genre that drew me in like that. So when I started writing my own stories, it was just a natural thing. Now it's just part of how I think about the books. And some are more romantic than others. And it depends on the characters.
Yeah. Well, another theme that's runs pretty consistently through your series, and it's one of the things that I really like about it, is found family. I don't think any of the other found families are quite as big as the Sokolovs in the Sacramento series, but some of them are pretty extensive, and you seem to keep track of all of them just fine. Do you have a particular method for keeping up with all of these interconnected people?
Well, they all still live in my head. And if you give me a second or two, I can figure out all the spider web connections. But to be quite honest, I have an assistant who keeps a spreadsheet. And that started about probably 3 books ago. So up until then, I was just keeping them all in my head. And I would keep a spreadsheet of like book years, just so I could keep track and in my book world where books took place, so I could kind of track how old characters were getting as the books progressed. But I didn't really keep a database or a spreadsheet per se. But yeah, now I have an assistant and she has informed me that I have used the name Stacy far too many times. And Stacy is, and I never even, it was one of those subconscious things. Stacy was always a receptionist. And so I'm not allowed to have any more receptionists named Stacy.
Maybe she's the same Stacy and she just goes from book to book and dyes her hair or something.
Exactly. She said it's like Pokemon where you have Nurse Jenny or Officer Joy or whoever they were. But yeah, the characters themselves, sometimes I will forget a detail, and she's really good about, like, well, you did this last. I was like, oh, okay. But most of the time they're in my head because for me, they're real people.
Yeah. Well, what draws you, and what do you think draws a lot of readers? They're not, because they might not be the same thing, to found families. It seems like series with found families have very loyal readerships who are loyal in part because of the found families.
Well, I have a family I'm born into, and I love them. We're not geographically close, but we talk often. But I have been very lucky in my life to have found families along the way. And I call them my sisters of the heart, because to me they're every bit as close, they're every bit as much a part of me as the family I was born into. And you do end up with a different dynamic with found families, I think. And not to put too blunt a note, a point on it, but found families are with you because they want to be, versus sometimes the families you're born into are there because you're born into them. And so again, you get a kind of a different kind of dynamic. And many times the members of found families are very appreciative of that, because either they haven't had a good experience, they've lost family members along the way and they're lonely, but they're very appreciative of the bonds of found family when it's a family you're born into. You might take it for granted and you might not think about it. So I think that there's definitely a draw for found families. I think many of us have those. We may not call them that, but we have the people we depend on, and they may have be no relation to us whatsoever. But like I said, I'm very fortunate to have many sisters of the heart, and I treasure it. So I know that if anything ever happens to my born family, I have the found family.
Yeah.
And I think that's a comfort to a lot of people.
We were talking on a Christmas panel a couple of months ago about why people like Christmas stories so much. And it was kind of one element that we all kept coming back to was a lot of people don't have the best born family situation. And so a Christmas story with its feel-good ending, or a found family story with all these people who choose to be with you, is in a way an escape from the fact that sometimes people are not happy in their natural family. I went back and reread your Valentine's Day short story today, and I'm not going to spoil it for people, but what you said reminded me of one of the lines in the story. I think it's Danny's line, and she says, "We choose you." And that meant so much to the characters that she was talking to.
Yeah. I don't mind spoiling it a little bit. Those were two children that she adopted, and she chose them to be part of her family. And I think it gives people hope. The whole Christmas phenomenon thing that you're talking about, it lets people think that, I might be lonely now, but I could have a family. I can find a family. I can make a family. And it kind of, it makes us feel a little less isolated.
Yeah, I think so. Some editors, particularly in romance, don't like to see the hero and heroine from a prior book step into the spotlight in the current book. You don't seem to have any problem getting that done. And I would be interested to know why you always make I wouldn't, well, it's probably too much to say you make a point of it, but you do it very frequently. And is there a particular reason for that?
I enjoy it. To me, it just seems like revisiting with old friends. And I think the readers enjoy it as well. And I have to say, my editors didn't mind it, and they liked it until the first time a character, a heroine from a previous story, got hurt.
Oh,
I know, she was like, "You can't do that." I'm like, "She's okay in the end." and it went in the book, but the initial reaction was, you can't let a heroine from a previous book get hit by a car. And I'm like, "But she lived, she's fine." But but I do enjoy bringing it back, those little cameo situations, and sometimes I just do it because I can.
yeah.
There's a scene in one of the Cincinnati books where there's a character, and I always have a side story going along, and usually the side story will bring in levels of detail that the hero and the heroine don't know yet, but I want the reader to know. And this kid was from Chicago, and he was a college kid from Chicago, and all of a sudden people are trying to find him, and it's because of something that had happened when he was basically living on this, almost a homeless kid in Cincinnati. And he'd gotten away and gone to college, and he was in Chicago now. And one of the people trying to help him gets killed. And it turns out that the detective on the case in Chicago is Abe Reagan, along with Mia Mitchell from their books, which were some of the early books. And I just did it because I could, and because I liked it. And it was just, not even more than 5 or 6 lines, but you find out, that he's got more kids, and that they're happy. And then there's just like a little bit of banter, and then they go away, But yeah, I do enjoy that. And for me, it's just like revisiting old friends. It's like old home week.
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about characters, do you have a set process for creating characters, or do you kind of work out of the situation for the plot, or do you start with the character?
Well, I always start with the character only because it's one of the tools I use to propel myself into the book. Yeah, because I hear people say, "Oh, my favorite is the first part of the book," and I hate the first part of the book. It's very stressful, and it's because there are so many different ways this book could go. It's like you're standing in that long hallway, and there's like a bazillion different doors, and behind one is a tiger, and what if I choose the wrong one, and I'll have 50,000 words that I'll have to throw away, which is a huge nightmare. So I got to the point where instead of staring at that empty screen, I'll put hero, heroine, villain, and underneath each one, I bullet point who they are, who their family is, and then I'll have who they are, how old they are, just the general stuff, and then who is their family, who is their work group, and so kind of building the world around them in which they exist. And I'll do the same for the heroine. And then I'll do the same for the villain. And if there's any sub-villains, they get their bullet points too. And by the time I get to the end of it, I may not know them really well, but I know how they fit together, and I can start thinking about the story then. And then I'll start writing the outline, and the outline becomes a story. And that's kind of how I sneak my way in now, versus that paralyzing fear of looking at that blank screen. So I started to do that again, probably about 20 books ago. And I have done it ever since. And now it's just habit. It's habit for me. But I will start with a character. Sometimes I know them well. Sometimes they're a character from a previous book, and sometimes they're brand new. And it just depends on the book. But not always. I don't always plan the characters that are going to have their own books later. Sometimes they just pop up. And that's always really fun. That for me, that makes it fun. For the biggest one that popped up was Deacon Novak, and he's kind of like the star of my Cincinnati series.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, he is pretty cool. And it was interesting because, and we can talk a little bit about this because you said you wanted to talk about Into the Dark. But when I first started, Deacon wasn't in the outline. He wasn't in the work group of the hero. He wasn't anywhere. And this, the hero, it was Did You Miss Me in the Baltimore series. And Joseph, the hero, he's standing there in an alley looking at a dead body who's covered in boxes, and the only thing you could see is red socks. And I kept, I had like Witch of the West vibes going on. And he's standing there talking to somebody else about this body. And then and this has never happened since, never happened before, never happened since. I heard the Clint Eastwood pipe music in my head. And he turns around and there's Deacon Novak standing in the alley with the wind blowing, and he's got this black trench coat and the hair and the glasses and the eyes, and he's an odd character. He has white hair and he has bicolored eyes and heterochromia, and he just kind of looks like something out of an anime or a comic book character. And in my mind, he was kind of a cross between an anime character and Blade, you know, and he took over. And I had to have a conversation with him that if he continued to try to take over with a book that was not his book, he would get excised from the book. But that if he cooperated, he could have his own book someday. So when it came time to write Deacon's book, I sat and I didn't really know why I had done the white hair. I didn't know why I had done any of that stuff. And then it occurred to me when I sit down to write his book, because there's a genetic syndrome that runs through my family, and it causes all of those things. And if I didn't have if I didn't take extra chemical steps with my own hair, it would be Snow White. I have a cousin that's got a brown eye and a blue eye. I've got a cousin who's got two different color. He's got the heterochromia. And it was when I realized that I had truly subconsciously, I did not know I was doing it at the time. Had worked my own family genetic history into this character, and he became a real special character for me, him and his family.
Well, you said that in the afterword to Into the Dark. Yeah. And he has a sister who's the heroine of that book, and a younger brother who has similar issues. Mm-hmm. And that's not the only problem that Danny or Greg has. And so it's rare to see an author come out and say, this book is very personal for me because of the kinds of factors that you just mentioned. And so what led you to decide to be so frank with people?
I think it was that when I looked at Deacon, I saw the opportunity for a do-over. And what I mean is when I was a little girl, I was born with the white streak. I had black hair and I had this white streak, and I looked different than the other kids. There's definitely a pattern of features that goes with the syndrome. And so I looked different than other kids, and I got made fun of horribly. It was awful. And I got to be that kid. And some kids would have just been, whatever, and they would have been all cocky about it. But I was the kid who I kept shrinking and getting smaller and smaller. I just wanted to be invisible. And, it was when I would go into a room with everyone else, I would shrink to the corner. I would be the one trying to be invisible. And when Deacon came into the books, he owned that first impression. He basically made the very most of it, and he used it. He knew that his eyes were kind of odd, and he used it to put people off their stride so that he could ask them questions, and they'll surprisingly give him answers. And Deacon for me was the do-over. If I had known then what I know now, that's what I would have done. I would have been Deacon. So for me, it was the opportunity to kind of look back and say, almost have that conversation with the kid I had been, and knowing that there are other people out there who might feel the same way. But I also like to include disabilities in my books. And because I have disabilities, my kids have disabilities. And so many times when we see disabilities in a book or in a TV show, it's the disability of the week. Yeah. The book is about that. So we're going to educate you, and it's a combination between movie of the week and, an after school special kind of a thing. And then that character goes away and you never see him again. And they're not part of the group. They're not part of the family, of that found family. They're just, it's almost exploitative in its own way of the disability. And so when I put people in my books with disabilities, they are part of the family. They are part of the group, whether they have Down syndrome, whether they're in a wheelchair, whether they can't hear, like Danny and Greg, or maybe Danny just can't hear in one ear, so she has to use hearing aids of a certain type. Or, in Danny's book, where the young man has to see, he has to see Danny because he's been assaulted. And it's not enough that he has to go through this, the indignity and the humiliation of a doctor's exam. He has to do it with social workers there because he's underage, and an interpreter. A person who's deaf rarely has the privacy of a one-on-one session with a doctor, a therapist, any of the situations where hearing people take for granted that they have that one-on-one privacy. A deaf person doesn't have that. And so I wanted to work that into the books. I wanted people to truly understand, because in presenting anyone who's different as part of the group, we make it easier for people in society at large to accept people who are different, because then they just become part of you. They're part of the group, and they're not special. They're not that after school special or that disability of the week. And so when I put that at the end, it was really meant to help people understand that what was in the book was really personal for me. And Danny has a lot of other things going on that don't have anything to do with me, but the issues with not being able to hear and feeling a bit outcast, as a younger person, that was definitely me. There's a lot of me in her.
Well, and you also used Michael's need for an interpreter. You wove that into the larger plot.
Yeah.
In a way that made it more three-dimensional. And by it, I mean the theme of the hearing loss and the need for the interpreter. It gave it more depth than if we're just in a scene where he needs an interpreter.
Right, exactly. And I'll do a little bit of a spoiler. The interpreters hear, they hear classified and they hear confidential information. And whether they're an interpreter in a doctor's office, an interpreter in a mental health therapist office, or in a police department, they're hearing confidential information, and they make it's kind of like, doctors do no harm. They have an oath that they're, whatever they hear is confidential, but they become, it can become a liability for the interpreter if they hear the wrong thing. And so that got worked into the book.
Yeah. Switching gears a little, but still staying with family. On your website, you said that writing the Philadelphia Atlanta series, which turned into a Bartanian trilogy, showed you the importance of planning a trilogy before you start writing. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I had never written a trilogy before. I had written Die For Me was my 7th book. And up until then, the books were connected in that the characters worked with each other, or they were brothers and sisters, so there were family connections and there were work connections. I sat down to write Die For Me, and I had a plan. I was going to write Die For Me, and then I was actually going to go back and pick up a book that everybody had been asking for, David Hunter's book, and you meet him in several books, working up to this. He was a brother of the hero in the very first book. So the next book was going to be David's. And I sat down to write Die For Me, and I had just watched a movie about time travel to medieval England, or France, I think it was. And I was just like, wouldn't that be kind of fun? But no, I wouldn't last like 15 seconds because I like my flushing toilets. But the whole thing about medieval warfare, that was kind of got me into, writing this book. There were video games, there's swords, there's all kinds. It's a fun book. It was a fun book to write. But again, one of these characters that pops in that's not as expected, Daniel Bartanian, was not part of the original outline. He was supposed to be a walk-on, walk-off character that finds out that his parents are dead because they're 2 victims that are in this field in Philadelphia that's filled with victims. It's a serial killer's burial ground. And so he was supposed to walk in, walk off, and be gone. But he didn't do that. There was something wrong, and there was something off with his parents. I mean, clearly he doesn't know his parents are dead at the time. The hero and heroine know. He doesn't know yet. And he's trying to figure out what happened to them. And as he digs deeper, he finds that his family has even more secrets than he knew they had. And he ends up with this mystery at the end. And I was like, well, and he has a sister who doesn't want anything to do with him. And I didn't know why that was. I'm like, well, he seems like a pretty nice guy to me. Why doesn't she want anything to do with him? So I get to the end of the book and I was like, well, I sewed that one up nicely, but now I have this other mystery. I guess I better write it to find out what happens. And I guess I better figure out why Susanna doesn't want anything to do with him. And that became the trilogy. Well, when I finally got to the last book, I hadn't planned any of it. I was writing. I mean, I would plan each book, you know, as much as I outlined, but I was just writing along merrily. And then I realized that there was this little detail. And here's just an example, but the detail of eye color. Both Daniel and his brother Simon, who's the villain of the first book in the series, have these very striking blue eyes. And when I first started writing the book, I had Susanna have these same blue eyes, and it was going to be part of the plot. And then I realized, oh my gosh, she doesn't. And in Die For Me, it was a throwaway line where she had gray eyes. And I'm like, okay, now what do I do? And I mean, I could have just shoved it off as being, you know, she was the only one in the family who didn't get it or whatever. But I decided that it would be, I also had a character that I didn't know what to do with. I didn't know what his part was in it. And I realized that he and the heroine were connected in a way that I hadn't expected, and explained why this other character was doing all the things he did. And it also explained why the heroine didn't look like the rest of her family. And it was, oh, okay. And so, but then I was so many loose ends I had to tie up. It was very stressful. So I got to the end and I said, if I ever do this again, I'm planning how all those little pieces fall together before I even get started. And so the next time I wrote a series, well, I wrote 2 books in Minneapolis in between, but then I changed publishers. And my new publisher, she was like you can have people from the past, like, as secondary characters, but we want a whole new series. And I had wanted to write the book, a series based on the opening credits of Law and Order for a long time. Because if you look at the original Law and Order, at the very end of the opening credits, you have Jack McCoy and whoever his assistant du jour is of the day, and Lenny Briscoe and whoever his partner is at the time they're walking to the camera. And I was like, I want to write that book. I want to write, you know, 2 lawyers, 2 cops, they all work together, and what are their stories? And so I sat down with the Baltimore and I planned it all out. But even then, there became connections between the stories I didn't expect. And that's what keeps it fun. You know, it makes it not be, oh, well, I wrote the outline, I know what's going to happen in the end, because I don't always know what's going to happen. So there still are surprises. But yeah, I found out that when you don't plan things, you end up with loose ends you have to weave in, and it is very stressful.
Well, when you said you sat down with Baltimore and you planned it all out, did you mean the book or the series?
I planned the series. I knew I wanted like 2 lawyers and 2 cops. So the first book is a cop, and his heroine is a medical examiner who turns out also plays the violin very much like Lindsay Sterling, who I didn't even know existed at the time, but a reader sent me. I found this video. I was like, oh my gosh, it looks like Lucy. That was actually that, and that story was based on I had a news story I'd actually seen that happened in real life. So that was that book. And then the second book was going to be the lawyer. And it was a lawyer who finds out that he, again, just a concept, that he finds out that he has tried an innocent man, that he has been duped into vociferously trying a man who has turned out to be innocent. And I knew who his heroine was going to be, because it's the only time I've based a character on a real life person at her request. I want to be the heroine and I want to get the hot guy. I was like, okay, fine. That was Paige. And then I knew that the third one was going to be a lawyer, and that was Daphne, who kind of has this like Dolly Parton thing going on. I really loved her, but I didn't know who her hero was going to be. He was very, very nebulous in my head, more like a kind of a frumpy Lenny Briscoe kind of a look to him. Turned out not to be. That character popped up in another book, and I was like, oh, okay, that's him. But the last book was Stevie's book. And it was a story I had wanted to write before, with this same editor, because who with my new publisher, I'd written an anthology, a short story for an anthology for her years before. And when I changed publishers, I went to her and I said, she wouldn't let me write this backstory then because she was pregnant with her 4th kid. But, and I'm feeling very maternal, but it was a story where a mother, and again, based on a true story, where a mother loses her husband and she's pregnant, but she loses her husband and her child in an accident. And in my book, it was in a robbery, but in the real life, it was an accident, and how she goes on. And I knew who her hero was going to be. He was a hero from a previous book. And so I was able to kind of develop that heat as I went through. And I knew what her story was going to be, but I didn't, there was a very big twist to who the real bad guy is in her story. And it has to do with the previous story in that series. And that's what I didn't expect. So I had the characters laid out, except for Daphne's hero, who made himself known in book 2. But it was more, I knew who the character was. I knew what each of their stories was going to be. I wasn't really sure how they would interconnect. And that's kind of what happened as I wrote along.
Well, mentioning the different cities brings up the question of how did you pick which cities you were going to use for settings? Did you draw names out of a hat, or was there?
No, there's been a method, kind of a method to the madness. Chicago I picked because I was living in Cincinnati at the time, and I didn't want Cincinnati because I'm like, who wants to write about Cincinnati? Because I was kind of, I always say Cincinnati is a great place. I grew up in DC. DC is a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there because it's too busy. But Cincinnati is a nice place to live, but I wouldn't want to visit there. It's just a normal town, It's got a lot of nice things. So if you do visit Cincinnati, there's a lot of nice things there. But I thought, well, Chicago's a big city. I want a big city where somebody could get lost, because this was my character who was running from her abusive husband, where a character can get lost and become somebody new, and where the police department is big enough that I could have police officers meet for the first time, even though they've been cops for their whole careers, that, years could go by before they ran into each other. And so that was Chicago. Philadelphia came along because I was working with a woman named Ciccatelli, who was from Philly, and she was a teacher in the school where I was working. And I just thought, well, why not? And I took her out for dinner one night. She told me all about her family. So I that's how the Ciccatelli family kind of came to be. Atlanta was because Daniel Bartanian walked across my screen and wouldn't go away. But Minneapolis, I always feel like that one was kind of I liked writing the town. I love the town, but I have a friend, my oldest friend lives in Minneapolis. And she's like, you should write a book set here. You could come here for the release. And I said, it's going to be in February. I'm not coming to Minneapolis in February. She goes, oh, she said, we're not like other people. We're not afraid of a little snow. I was living in Florida at the time, and I was afraid of a little snow, but I did. I wrote 2 books there. I went for the first rollout, and there was a snowstorm, and she and I were almost stranded in the bookstore along with the bookseller, and nobody came because it had started. I'm like, you said people would come out. And the thing I remember was that the bookseller, the only thing we could do, the bookseller had the entire house, the old TV show House, had the DVD collection, and we were watching the story, and my oldest friend's husband is an ER doctor. He's the one who helps me kill people sometimes in my books. And she's like, that's not the way it happens in real life. That's not the way it happens. That's not realistic. And finally, the bookseller turned to my friend. She goes, I have a roll of duct tape, and I'm not afraid to use it. So that was my Minneapolis experience. Then I changed publishers, and they were like, okay, how about something new? And I was like, oh, I was born in Baltimore. Why not? So Baltimore was because I was born and raised there. And then came the next time, and I was thinking about New York, and my editor's like, no, I don't want any books set in New York. And I'm like, I lived in Cincinnati, how about that? So she said, yeah. So, I lived Cincinnati for 15 years. I consider it probably more of my home town than I do DC, which is where I lived until I was done with college. But after Cincinnati, I realized I hadn't gone very far west. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, there's Baltimore and then Cincinnati, and I had met up with a group of writing friends, and I'm still with them, and they would meet in Northern California, And so it was really my first exposure to California, other than just flying in and out of LA, or like the one day I spent in San Francisco doing focus groups when I worked for, when I was an engineer. And I would either fly in and out of San Francisco or Sacramento. And I have a couple of writing friends in Sacramento. And so I would spend time there. I'm like, I could set a series here. It's big enough that I can have my cops work their whole career and not know each other. But it also, it has more of a, Sacramento has more of a Midwestern feel to me than like LA would. And I've always been careful about setting a story in either LA or New York, because there's such a distinctive feel to them that, you're like, if I read a book that's set by somebody who's never lived in New York, a lot of times I can tell, because it doesn't feel real. So that's where the California series came from. Plus there was a cult in there, and Northern California is perfect. There was, people don't realize that California is not all LA. There are huge portions of the state where you can't get a cell phone signal. You could drive for hours and not see a single soul. I mean, it's extremely remote. Setting a cult there was great.
That becomes important, the lack of a cell phone signal. And actually, I was planning to ask you if there was something about California in particular that made it, I should hold it where people can actually see it rather than just the top of the cover, that made it ideal for your cult. And you really just answered that question.
Yeah, it really is. If you look at a lot of the cults, they get their start in Northern California because it is so remote. It is isolated. It's very beautiful. It's extremely beautiful, but it is, and there are places where there are canyons, deep canyons, that you take a wrong turn, people don't find your car for a couple months. It's not like, a passerby can say, oh, there's a car down there. I mean, you just can't. It's that rugged and that remote. And so that became part of the second book and the third book, which comes out in August. But yeah, so California, I wanted to write California, but I needed to find a place where I felt like I could duplicate the dialogue and everything properly. And Sacramento felt very, very it felt like a town where I could do that. It's also it also has a lot of interesting weather patterns that become important. I mean, things like summers, it can be 108 degrees and it is so hot. It's not like Florida hot. Florida hot is like you can't breathe, but it's really hot. And then, there are places in the winter where, up in the mountains where you get a lot of snow. So you get, again, there's a lot of topographical and geographical variety as well. So it was fun. It was fun to write the stories. It was fun going on searching. We actually went on a trip, where can we put our cult? Oh, there were so many places to put a cult.
Well, that sounds like a fun research trip, actually.
It was. So I've started a new series, and it's in a fun city that I visited several times. And I would have visited it again, but unfortunately travel is not a thing right now. I will, so when it's safe to travel again, I will go there. But we're making some of the food here and kind of getting in the mood and listening to podcasts from people who are, who live there. So I can kind of you want to make sure you can hear the cadence of the people talking in your head. That's also important, so that, they have the right sound, but you're not overdoing it.
Are you ready to tell us what that city is, or would you rather not?
I've been hinting at it on Twitter, like some of the foods my husband's making. He made beignets this week.
Well, that's a pretty big hint, actually.
It's a hint, people. The last time I hinted, it was far too subtle. So I'm like, hint, this is a hint.
Well, the thing about Twitter is it can be great, but if you're not looking at your feed when something comes through, you might never, ever, ever see it.
Unless it starts trending, and then you're like, okay, you and the rest of the country see it then. But
then Twitter kind of shoves it in your face.
Yeah.
But switching from locations to themes, I was looking back over the list of your books today, and I think it struck me because I had just finished Say No More. But that book is really, as you said earlier, about a wife who's been abused and whose husband would surely have killed her had she not fled. And abuse comes up a lot in your books. And I'm interested to know how you handle a theme like that, which in some ways is more sensitive than just violence.
Yeah.
And sometimes more personal to people, without making it prurient or titillating or overly distressing, for lack of a, and I don't mean that it's not concerning and that you're not worried for the characters and that bad things don't happen, but they don't happen in a way that makes people put the book down and walk away. Yeah. And do you have a particular method for dealing with that, or is it just kind of the way it comes out?
I worried about that when I first started writing the characters. I didn't want to be exploitative or any of those other things that you mentioned. And to me, I'm less likely to show the abuse in real life, in real time, more likely to show the impact that that past abuse has had on the person that they are today. And that kind of sets their starting point for their character growth and their character arc, you know, as they come through the book. And I think not focusing on the abuse itself and just focusing on them rebuilding and retaking their life kind of gives a positive, it highlights the positive, while at the same time acknowledging the negative, the lasting negative effects. And I remember being a little concerned that, you know, I was not doing a good thing by putting, you know, people who had been, you know, suffered domestic violence in my books. And I was actually reading an article that about Mariska Hargitay, she's Olivia Benson in Law and Order SVU. And she, and what caught my eyes in this interview, she was saying the exact same thing. She worried that by portraying Olivia Benson on this show, that she was basically making a living on the backs of people who had suffered, and she wasn't feeling really good about that. And, you know, Law and Order is filmed in New York City, and she was having lunch. I could think they'd broken for lunch. She was having lunch in a diner, and this woman came up to her, and you know, first she thought she just wanted an autograph, so she was getting, but the woman said, "Thank you." She said, I was a victim of domestic violence or you know, some sort of abuse. I can't remember what it was now, but she said, your TV show, your portrayal gives me a voice. It lets me say all the things I can't say for myself. And I was like, oh. And shortly thereafter, through my career, especially since my first book was about domestic violence, I've gotten a lot of emails from readers, and invariably they're either flat out grateful, you know, that they can see themselves in a book portrayed so positively, or they're just dang proud of themselves, you know. And the first one I got was a woman who, she said that she had gone through the same, you know, she had been a battered wife. And then she said, even though my escape wasn't as dramatic as your Caroline's, she basically escaped in a fairly dramatic fashion. And she's, and 15 years had passed. She'd found she'd met another man. They'd gotten married. They'd had many, many good years together. And she said, he used to ask me what it was like, and I couldn't tell him. But then I gave him your book, and now he knows. And you're just like, you know, I still get all choked up just thinking about it. And I've gotten many of those emails over the years. So for me, it just seems like I put myself in the head of, you know, what are the lasting after effects? How does that feel? What impact does that have on the choices that you make every day? And kind of put myself in that spot. And then that's where the characters come from. So I did worry about it for a long time, but I don't worry about it now. You know, to me, it just seems like I want to do it right. I'm careful to do it right. Like when I wrote a woman who had been through breast cancer, I talked to a lot of women who had breast cancer. You a woman who had been sexually abused by, as a child. I talked to people who had been through that. Danny, not only does she have, the hearing issues, she also has she's HIV positive. I wanted to do that right. But otherwise, it does become exploitative and titillating and, prurient and all those things. And, but these are people. To me, they're real people, but they represent real people for sure. And those real people have real lives. And I think if you portray them with the positivity and the dignity, while also acknowledging that they're just a little bit broken inside, I think it comes. I hope it comes out as being genuine and sincere.
Well, I think it does, and you really put a lot of emphasis on dignity with Michael in Into the Dark, and on the aftermath of having experienced abuse and indoctrination with Gideon and Mercy in Say No More, because that's the book, as you well know, where they actually confront their issues. It kind of comes up, I'm blanking on the name of the one with them before that. That's not theirs. It's Gideon's story. Say You're Sorry.
Right.
And Say You're Sorry. But that conflict kind of stepped to the fore because it's Mercy's book and Gideon's in it too. And
they have a lot of unresolved personal issues.
They do. And I think sometimes as a society, things like human trafficking and child trafficking and abuse are things we kind of prefer to look away from. Mm-hmm. And so that if they're in our fiction and we're reading about it, I don't know if you set out to do that or not, but I think it raises awareness of the problem on a broader spectrum.
In many ways, I do. When I wrote about human trafficking for the first time in my Baltimore series, and I did quite a bit of research on the reality of human trafficking today, and it was shocking. I mean, I was really stunned that the 2/3 of the people who are who are illegals illegally in this country, who are undocumented in this country, came legally, but their visas and their passports were taken as part of this whole trafficking thing. They were duped into believing they were coming for a better life, only to become a victim, of their traffickers. And how many of them have advanced degrees? Most of them have high school. It is not like we're talking about people who are not properly educated. These are people who are just many times are betrayed by somebody they know, who says, "Oh, I've got this great opportunity for you," and they get here and they're trapped. I started to see, the whole hospitality industry was a real problem, because that's where a lot of these undocumented people who are trapped, that's when they end up working. And I remember flying shortly after I started writing the series and starting to see big billboards in airports teaching people how to see the signs. So it wasn't, it was kind of the beginning of the, let's let people know. And since then you start seeing, stories where there's a flight attendant on an airplane who sees something that doesn't look quite right. It's a young woman who's not dressed quite right. She doesn't meet anybody's eyes. She manages to slip the girl a note, and the girl's being trafficked, and she's able to save her. Seeing the being taught to see the clues and the symptoms of trafficking, of abuse. There was one just last couple of weeks ago where there was a woman who worked at a restaurant, I think it was in Orlando, and she saw bruises on the arms of this little kid. "Are you all right?" And the kid was like, but then later she asked again, and the kid was like, "No, I'm not okay." And it turned out it was either father or stepfather was beating the crap out of him. And so she was able to get him out of that situation, but it was because she had been trained to look for the signs and know what to do. So I think that's really kind of that's a big part why I want to do this. Like, look for the signs and if it's not safe for you to do something right now, do something as soon as you can, and maybe save somebody's life. To me, that whole prospect of education. I mean, I write books first and foremost to entertain, but if we can teach people something along the way, that's bonus. That's just gravy.
Well, shifting to a little bit lighter note, on your note about writing "No One Left to Tell,"
Mm-hmm.
this line really struck me because you described it as the black belt who had been so confident now knew fear. And I think that's a great line. Could you, for those who haven't read that little note, could you tell us about that?
By note, do you mean
on your website? Or I think it's
yeah.
also in the back of the book, but yeah.
Well, that's actually an interesting, again, real life and my fiction tend to collide so many times when I'm not expecting it. That was the character where my friend said, I want to be in your book and I want to get the hot guy. She was my karate teacher. And she is, to this day, the most decorated female martial artist in the world. She's got, like, I think over 20 gold medals from World Games. She was a co-captain of the Olympic team. She's truly phenomenal. I had to water her down a lot in the book because nobody would have believed it. She would have been one of those two over-the-top characters. So I watered her down for she was still happy with it. There's a scene where the hero goes through her spare room and she's got all these trophies that are 5-6 feet tall. That was my friend's living room. I can remember I felt like I was in a forest. I'm only 5 feet tall, in this forest of trophies that were taller than I was. But she was a character in my Minneapolis series that I bring into my Baltimore series. And I sat down with my friend. We went out to dinner one night and I said, Sonny, I need to know why she would leave her dojo. Because the dojo is like your found family. Or if you're into martial arts, your dojo is your family. And I'm like, why? And she was very involved in her dojo in Minneapolis. Why would she leave? I mean, I need her to leave. I need her to be in Baltimore for this series. But why would she leave? And Sunny thought about it and she said, I think it was because something would happen that really upended her and harmed her confidence. She said, if it were me, because she would teach self-defense classes back then, if I had taught someone a move and they tried it and it got them killed, I would never be able to forgive myself. And that kind of became the kernel of Paige's, the thing that started Paige. And then because she had done this, because she had taken up for this person, and then was then faced with the rage of that person's abuser herself and gotten hurt, that really undermined her own self-confidence, and that became Paige. Well, while I was writing this book, and I was probably already a third into it, there was a tragedy that happened in our community. And when I was a teacher at a school for the arts, when I was a full-time high school teacher, and we didn't have a phys ed program, but we did have Taekwondo. And the gentleman who was the Taekwondo teacher, his name was Ken Ellis, and Ken was murdered. Well, he was murdered when I was about a third of the way through the book. And this man was a black belt. He could defend himself. He was, he was very active in the community, teaching people self-defense skills. And one day, and it was a really odd story, because somebody knocked on the door, and it was about 10 o'clock at night. He gets up, he had been sleeping on the sofa. He gets up, he opens the door, and there was nobody there. And he kind of went outside on the front porch, came back in, and these two men dressed in black, kind of like ninjas, jumped out and shot him.
Oh.
And his wife was the only one home alone with him. And she ran out. She's calling 911. He dies in her arms.
Oh.
And there was shock, Ken was so well loved by everyone. They ended up, for his memorial service, they had to have his memorial service in the local, the Civic Center, because he was so well loved by so many people. They couldn't have just had it in a church. They had to have this huge place for his memorial service. And it kind of hit me hard, because in that book, I'd already written that you basically bullet trumps karate. If somebody comes at you with a bullet, even if you you're a martial artist, expert. You are vulnerable. You are vulnerable to someone with, with a gun, or with maybe you could fight your way out with a knife, from a knife, but with a gun, if they really want to hurt you, they can hurt you. And it was that vulnerability that really gave Paige an edge. And I had to put that book aside for quite a while. I was so hurt and so devastated, that Ken had been killed this way. And I felt a little guilty. It's a strange thing. You're writing this book and then something happens that mirrors it. It had nothing to do with it, but I still felt a little guilty. And I eventually was able to finish the book. But yeah, that was the base of Paige's vulnerability. Was she had, one of her students had died trying to defend herself with something she taught her. And then when Paige tried to help her, she became a target herself.
Wow.
Sorry, you were going to go for the lighter part, but
well,
they did catch Ken's killer. And this is actually kind of interesting in the way that law enforcement actually tends to work more often than not. Everyone was sure that the wife had done it. And, she even went on Good Morning America. They were trying to find his killer. In all the comments, oh, she did it, she totally did it. But a few years later, there was another murder in Sarasota. And when the police got a tip on where to find the weapon, they also found the weapon that had killed Ken through ballistics. And the two men, they were like 19 or 20 years old when they killed Ken, maybe 18. They were young. They had just been joyriding. They saw his wife in her study, because there's so many Florida houses have windows everywhere. They looked in the windows. They see her in her study. They think, oh, she's alone, because Ken was asleep on the couch, so they couldn't see him. We're going to just go in there and rob her. She'll be an easy mark. What they didn't expect is for Ken to answer the door. And that's how he got killed, because he answered his own door.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's tough for everybody.
It was tough for everybody. It was a horrible story, but it was, they did catch his murderers, and his murderers did get justice. So, they can't bring Ken back, but these murderers did face justice.
But that's something. I mean, no, it doesn't bring somebody back, but it's something.
It's something. And it took years. And it was complete. It seemed like it was a completely unrelated thing, and it took years. So, that whole CSI timeline, and even my books do to a certain extent, where the mystery solved in like 5 days or 24 hours or whatever. That's unrealistic. It makes for good TV, and it makes for good reading, I think. But, truly, law enforcement, many times the wheels turn very slowly.
Yeah. Well, two of my favorite books in your whole catalog are the 4th and 5th books in the Baltimore series, because they're about Clay Maynard and about Clay's daughter. So would you tell us what inspired Clay and his situation?
Clay, I always loved his character, and I knew he was a good person, because he shows up. He's actually introduced in my 4th book. He's the best friend of the hero in my 4th book. And when I said I'd set something in Baltimore, I'm like, I left Clay there. And so, he and Stevie kind of had this slow burn through the first 3 books, and then they get their 4th book. It was his relationship and wanting to be a stepfather to little Cordelia that just broke my heart. And there's I like country music, and there's a singer named Brad Paisley who sings a song called He Didn't Have to Be. And it's all about this little boy whose mom goes out on a date, and finally she brings home someone that wants to take him too. And, that they get married, and then, he became the father, he became the dad he didn't have to be. And at the end, they're standing there, and he's looking, I'm getting all tingly. He's standing there looking at his own baby through the hospital, window, and his dad standing next to him. I hope that I can be half the dad he didn't have to be. And so that was Clay. That became Clay's book. But I left this story untold. And actually, in the first draft of Watch Your Back, he did find his daughter, but the book was really long. And my editor was like, why don't you cut that out, and you can write another book about that later. So I did. I cut it out, and kind of left him looking for his daughter. And a couple years later, I'd actually tried to write that book a few times, but the characters were so young, and I was just like, I don't want to write people that young having a romance. My kids were that young. They were in their early 20s, which I was when I was married by the time I was 21. I had my first kid by the time I was 24, but somehow my characters need to be older, and more established. But we had some tragedies in our life. We had three family and friends die within the space of 3 weeks.
Oh,
I know. And when one of them was like a surrogate dad. And it kind of, again, comes to this whole father theme.
Yeah.
That's really heavy around Clay Maynard, is the family theme, the father theme. But my own father died about 10 years ago, and Martin's uncle was like a surrogate dad, and he did our wedding. He officiated our wedding. He was very ill at the end of his life. He lived with us. Martin took care of him, and he passed away, and he passed away with such grace and dignity, and I think at that point I was kind of done. My soul was empty at that point. Yeah. I was tired and I was grieving, and I needed to write this story about serial killers. And I was like, I just can't do that now. And so what I did was I went back and I picked up Clay's story, and I said, I just need somebody to have happy ending right now. And I needed to be fast. So this was supposed to be a novella. I'm not capable of really writing a novella, but my books are too long. But I wrote the story about how Clay meets his daughter. And I wrote it, and there had a suspense element to it. It was not really big, but so I wrote the book, and it took me 3 weeks. And I wrote the draft, and it was like 350 pages. And I sent it to my editor, and I said, I wrote this. It was the only time up till then and since I have written something that wasn't on contract. And I said, I did this. I don't know what you want to do with it, but I did it. I'm done. And she came back with, well, the suspense is a little weak. I said, I don't care. I just wrote it. I needed to refill my well. I wrote it. I had a happy ending. It's done. So I went and wrote another book that would have become, was Kate and Decker's book. And then I circled back around, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like months had passed at this point. The suspense in that really is awful. So I pulled out all the old suspense. I rewrote all the suspense stuff, and I threaded it back in. My editor was like, it doesn't even feel like it's the same book, but all of the Clay and Taylor stuff remained the same. And it was that scene where he meets her, and I was writing that scene. And I actually had a dream about my own dad that night. So it was all this, it was the theme of fathers who are good fathers, fathers who are terrible fathers, like the villain in Monster in the Closet. Clay, who was he was the stepfather he didn't have to be to Cordelia. And when he finally does meet Taylor, and then later meets the stepfather that hid Taylor from him for 20 years, he's able to forgive him, because he says in the end of the story, I don't want to be angry. Anger drives people away from you. I don't want to be angry. And if I'd been in your spot, I might have done the same thing, and you were just trying to protect my daughter. And she turned out pretty dang good. So thank you, And so they're able to kind of then almost co-father, co-parent Taylor, and who's about to get married, in her own real life, and in my head anyway. So there'll be a short story, probably a free short story about her wedding coming up soon. But yeah, it was that whole theme of fathers, but it stemmed from that Brad Paisley video that I heard, I don't know, 15 years ago, and I've just never been able to get it out of my head. I can be sitting in a restaurant, and the opening strains of that song come on, and I just bawled out, bawling like a baby. That song can do it to me every time. But yeah, it was Brad Paisley video that became the kind of the core of Clay Maynard.
Cool. Well, we've sort of been chatting for a while, and I'm wondering if you have any advice you would like to share with beginning writers.
I do actually. And this is the thing that I always say, and I don't mean it flippantly at all. I mean it seriously. I think one of the things that made my beginning writing as rewarding as it was that I wrote for fun. I wrote because I couldn't wait to see what the characters were going to do next. And I didn't really worry that it was going to be good or bad. I just wrote. And I learned, each book was better than the one before it, and I learned. And it took me many years to get there because I was doing it for fun. I wasn't really, wasn't focused on it for anything other than myself. But I think that lack of pressure helped me find my voice, is find the way that I wanted to write, the way that I wanted to portray characters. I think it helped me find that in a very low stress way, because I wasn't writing to get published. I was writing because I wanted to. And even now, when I kind of get overwhelmed with deadlines and I'm like, oh, I can't think, why did I ever think I could make a living at this? I have to go back and remember that I do this because I love the characters. And if I'm in that spot, it's because I've forgotten that. And I have to go back. It always comes back to the characters, but write for fun and don't write to get published. Because when you start to write to get published, it puts a level of stress on you that makes it stop being fun. So at the end of the day, once you do get published, there is a whole lot of other stressors. And then you have deadlines, and then you have editors, and then you have readers. Are they going to like it? Are they not going to like it? And you end up, you have to be writing because you love it, and because it's fun, and because you love the characters. And that's really the core of it. So I have people ask me all the time, well, did you go to school for writing? I didn't. You don't have to. You don't want to publish a book that's in shoddy shape or that's not written well, but you don't have to have a degree. You just have to sit your posterior section in a chair and start to write. And if the love for the characters is in your heart, in your head, it'll come out through your fingers onto the page.
Well, is there anything that you've got coming out just now or in the near future that you'd like to talk about?
Well, Say No More just came out in paperback this week. So if folks were waiting, for the lower price, or so that it matched all the other paperbacks on your shelf, or for whatever reason people make the format choices they do, it's out. The audio is amazing. Joel Leslie, who also he records as Joel Frumkin as well. He's the narrator. I don't know if you've ever met him at Coastal Magic. No. He's a great narrator. He's done he did Say You're Sorry and Say No More. So it's available in audio. It's available in audio if that's your pleasure. And then I have the third book in the series, which really didn't touch on very much, but it's called Say Goodbye, and it comes out in August. And the main character in that book is Tom Hunter, who was the son of my very first heroine in book one. So it's my 25th book. So it kind of comes, and I didn't realize it was going to be my 25th book till I was like, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. So we kind of came for a full circle and it comes out in 2021, and my first sale was in 2001. So there's a lot of circles that happen. Say Goodbye. And that comes out in August.
Well, neat. Since we didn't touch on it much, is there anything else that you would like to tell us about that book?
Well, Say Goodbye is Tom's book. Like I said, of course, you get to see Gideon and Daisy and Rafe and Mercy in the book. They all appear. Of course, Irina Sokolov is there. She's still peddling her famous specialty, which is, cannabis laced tea, which is completely legal in California. But his heroine is Liza Barkley, and Liza was a character in I Can See You. Yeah, it was I Can See You, which is my second Minneapolis book, my first Minneapolis book. And Liza had just lost her older sister to the serial killer in that book. So she's 7 years older, has always been in love with Tom Hunter, but he didn't feel the same way. And so that's kind of where they start their book. But Liza's been in the military. She is kick-ass. Can I say that? I'm not supposed to.
You can say that, yeah.
Kick-ass. She's and very protective. She's studying to be a nurse. So there's a lot of really good things about Liza Barkley. I just kind of fell in love with her character. So yeah, that book comes out in August. You get to see the whole Sokolov family. And hopefully the ending to Eden will be satisfactory to all.
Well, thank you. Karen, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's watched this program.